Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to BWTM Sports Gaming. I was shocked at the news of George Foreman's passing. Big George Foreman. George Foreman, for me, was more than just a boxer. He was more than just that big puncher, or the guy with the grill, or the commentator, the personality, the preacher, the family man, the guy that got beaten Zaire. He was more than that. The guy that came back and became heavyweight champion of the world. He was more than even that to me. Because if I were to sit here as I'm giving this tribute to Big George Foreman, may God continue to bless his soul. If I just sat here and said, George Foreman, and reeled off his history and reeled off his fights and talked about what he did, I would be doing myself a disservice, and I think I would be doing. I would just be doing a disservice to myself. So I'm going to tell you my personal experience with George Foreman and those connected to George Foreman in my journey of life. And it will be quite interesting for some of you who probably don't know, but you're going to learn today a little bit more. So let me take you back to the first time I came across George Foreman as a young boy. George Foreman was, obviously I wasn't around when he fought in Zaire, but obviously, and he fought Ali. I wasn't around for that. The rope-a-dope you heard about. As a youngster, I did do some boxing as amateur. And the rope-a-dope was the thing. There's lots of connections here. So I'm going to try and take this as slow as I can to connect the dots, because there's a lot of dots to connect. So the rope-a-dope, when I was at West Ham boxing gym, I remember a trainer, I think his name was Frank. Black guy, Frank. He used to say to me, "You can't come here and think you're Muhammad Ali." That's what he said to me. He said, Ali, you were smart. You did the old rope-a-dope. And I never understood what he said at the time about the rope-a-dope. Well, the next thing I heard about was George Foreman. And the story I heard about George Foreman was apparently he punched a cow in his head, or horse or something. He punched it with one punch. That's how hard George Foreman punched. Now, I don't know if that was propaganda or not, or stories or not. I don't know. But this is my personal, as a young boy, hearing about George Foreman and how fearsome. Then my dad told me about George Foreman. He was telling me about George Foreman and how he lifted a guy off his feet with an uppercut. He bounced Fraser off his feet. My dad was an avid boxing fan, yeah. And he told me Foreman lifted Fraser off his feet. I'm like, what? Yeah, it was one uppercut, he said. He lifted him off his feet. I'm like, wow. This guy, George Foreman's a real punch. He's a real puncher, a real menace. Guy, he's really brutal in the ring, knocking guys out of that. He said, but my dad said Muhammad Ali played with him and then knocked him out. And that was like me and my dad, I won't say we had a great relationship, but the one things we connected on was boxing and cricket anyway. 17 years old this is now. 17 years old, I decided to move out of home. During that time, there were two people I watched in boxing. Two people in particular. I had a VHS recorder. It was Gary Mason. And at the time, I liked Gary Mason. He fought a guy called Jess Harding. Actually was promoted by Barry Hearn. And Jess Harding was fighting Gary Mason. Mason knocked him out in 2 rounds and says, "You pick him up or I'll knock him down." And the minute he said that, and the way he knocked out, and he kept saying he wanted to fight Tyson. Mike Tyson, it was Gary Mason. He says, you pick him up and I'll knock him down. We'll carry on until something else happens. Because it was like the reporter at the time was questioning Gary Mason and how good Mason was. And, he's big and he's slow and stuff. Mason was British champion at the time as well. But anyway, so let's hold Mason there for a minute. So that's Gary Mason. We'll come back to Gary and how he connects to George. Anyway, so 17 years old, yeah, 17 years old. I'd already watched George Foreman fight Evander Holyfield for the heavyweight championship of the world. I remember my dad telling me, again, my dad telling me, what's George Foreman coming back for? He's a big old man. What's that man coming back for? Isn't he making enough money in the church? Apparently, George wasn't making enough money in the church, and that's what caused his comeback. So I'd see him fight against Holyfield, a really good fight against Holyfield. Holyfield, another fighter, a connection. Holyfield 1 second, put him in a corner. There's a connection there as well. So he fought 12 rounds against Holyfield. I wanted George to do it. Every time he hit Holyfield right, I think he's going to do it. But the Holyfield was one of my favorite, is still one of my favorite fighters. Now I always remember Holyfield putting a combination against George, 14, 15 unanswered punches. And that's why I saw the cross-arm defense. It was the first guy I saw do the cross-arm defense. Was Big George Foreman against Evander Holyfield. And Foreman had his moments in that fight. I remember people talking, Foreman's an old man. He has no business being in the ring. Typical media. That's no business being in the ring. He's an old man. Holyfield knocked him out in 2 rounds. Man, Holyfield fought the fight of his life when he fought Foreman. So, good night. And then he fought Tommy Morrison. And I thought he would beat Morrison for the title. I think they gave the decision to Morrison that night. And then here we are, 17 years old. Let's catch up now. 17 years old. I've moved out of home. This is my first week I've moved out of home. My mum and dad had moved me into this place, Haringey Road I was living. In Haringey Road. Yeah. I think it might have been 47 Haringey Road. It was my first weekend being 17 years old and an independent. Well, in my one room, yeah. And George Foreman was fighting for the heavyweight championship of the world against Michael Moorer. And I remember this because when George was talking about, he kept saying he wanted to fight Michael Moorer. Moorer was the heavyweight championship of the world. I believe Moorer beat Holyfield for the titles. And George said, I want to fight that guy. I want to fight Michael Moorer. They're like, oh no, Michael Moorer, he beat up Holyfield. He's going to beat you up too, you know. And I'm thinking, you know what? If George lands that big right hand on Moorer's chin, he'll knock Moorer out. He will knock Moorer out. He just needs to land one big right hand on Moorer's chin. He'll knock Moorer out. Because Moorer had been, he'd been down a few times against Burt Cooper, but came back to win. But Moorer's chin was never the greatest. And I thought, if Big George can land one of them big right hands he landed on Holyfield, he'll knock Moorer out. And I remember the press was saying, Foreman can't do it. He's finished. He shouldn't fight no more. Foreman's an old man. Moorer's going to beat him up. I'll do blah, 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 blah. All this stuff about Foreman. And that night, I tell you, I watched this fight. It was on Sky Sports. Now, hold this thought. They used to start the show. Doom, 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 doom. And the tune was Some Like It Hot. And in the background of Sky Sports, it was George Foreman would be in the background throwing punches. Right? There's a silhouette of George Foreman throwing punches in the background at other fighters. Some like it hot. Some like it hot. So I remembered that. And that was the beginning. They were presenting George Foreman and Michael Moorer. And Michael Moorer was going to go on and do X, Y, and Z. And they would just get past George Foreman. That was it. And Foreman was getting outboxed by Moorer. And then Moorer decided to trade with Foreman. He stood right in front of George. And people have written George off, completely written him off. Like, it was impossible. And then George landed the right hand. And Moorer went down. And he went, he's done it. He's done it. He's done it. He's George. He's the heavyweight champion of the world. I remember he turns. He looks up to the skies. And I remember him looking up to the skies. Looking up, like, say thank you. And he turned around and it was just amazing. I think his brother must have passed out. Or someone in his family passed out at the time as well. Foreman had done it. He'd become a heavyweight champion of the world. And I watched that moment and captured that moment and said, you know what? Everyone wrote this old man off. They wrote Foreman off. They wrote him off. The press wrote him off. all the time, people talking rubbish about Foreman, how he shouldn't do this and he shouldn't do that and he shouldn't do this. And Foreman did it. Foreman believed himself and he became the oldest heavyweight champion in history. George Foreman, heavyweight champion of the world. He beat the man that beat Evander Holyfield convincingly. Big George Foreman. And that moment there stuck in my mind so much because it was like, and from 17, no matter what people say about you, you can do it. You can do whatever you put your mind to, regardless of what anybody says. Even if it's you in your room, but you in your room, your thoughts by yourself, you can do it. I'm not talking about delusion. I'm not talking about being delusionary now, but I think there's an element of people think you're delusionary in what you're trying to do or trying to achieve, but you're focused. You know what you can do. A lot of people's thoughts are based on what they're capable or incapable of doing, and they project that upon you. Or they don't want you to do it. If you do it, it's going to prove them wrong, and people's egos are too big for that. But I'm really happy. That was a capturing moment for George. So George became heavyweight champion of the world. And I followed George after that. Obviously, I continued to follow his career and his fights against Axel Schultz. I remember him against Shannon Briggs, a fight that I really feared for Foreman in that fight because Briggs was big, strong, powerful. I remember his fights against Alex Stewart as well. Big fights. Now, George Foreman was heavyweight champion of the world, right? And guess who's ranked number 4 in the world? Gary Mason. And in Gary Mason's next fight, he was 35-0 with 32 knockouts or something like that. And Gary Mason, his next fight, had he beaten Lennox Lewis, he would end up becoming the challenger to fight George Foreman for the heavyweight championship of the world. There you go. So there's your Gary Mason and your George Foreman. That never happened. Gary Mason got beat by Lennox Lewis, and the rest of that is history. So moving on. The amount of people that told me I couldn't do this and I wouldn't do that and I couldn't do this and this is not possible, friends and family and, well, I wouldn't even call them friends, just people who just didn't believe in me. But that Foreman moment, that moment there, if you want to call it a miracle, but it was superhuman what he did that night. Incredible. But I took that into my own life. And I had something called chronic fatigue syndrome for almost a good 10 years of my life. And I was told I couldn't do this, I couldn't do that. The doctor said I couldn't do this, doctor said I couldn't do that. The doctor said I'd have to rely on tablets. We fast forward in my own career in cricket. I ended up becoming a national community champion. And I overcome the chronic fatigue syndrome. When the doctors were saying, take the tablets for depression, blah, 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 all this stuff. Nope, I refused it. And I trained the mind. I said anything is possible. Of course, I overcame the chronic fatigue syndrome. And here I am today, living well and good. But the George Foreman story is not over yet. It's only just begun. A little later on, everyone knows I'm an avid gamer, right? So the avid games, one of the games, I love my boxing games. And one of the games I used to play was Evander Holyfield's boxing. Hold that one there for one moment. Again, connected to Evander Holyfield. There was a game called Buster Douglas boxing, right? The Buster Douglas boxing game and Evander Holyfield game also had a big George Foreman's, of course. That was a game. George Foreman's game, I think, was a little smoother. But Evander Holyfield's game was the boxing game, was the one. But George Foreman was quite good as well. So you played as George Foreman and you had to knock certain opponents out. There was that. There was Mike Tyson's Punch Out. And there was another one that was either Ring of Legends or something like that, which had Foreman, had Ali, had Fraser, Holyfield. It was a brilliant game. It was on a Sega Mega Drive. Brilliant absolutely brilliant boxing game. Holyfield's boxing was really good as well as George Foreman's and Buster Douglas. And you can play some of those games on the arcades. So there's the game there. Remember Evander Holyfield's boxing. Hold that right there. So we all know, or you don't know, that I started Bay Lorick TV. I started Bayloric TV because when I was doing my cricket, I noticed that we're doing a lot of things. And I wasn't getting the coverage myself, media-wise. Media just wasn't interested in anything that was positive. So I decided, you know what? Forget the media. I'm going to start my own media outlet. And on top of starting my media outlet, one person said to me, you can't do it. What do you know? Well, what do I know? Well, I ended up doing Bayloric TV. And would you believe it or not, turning from Bayloric TV to BWTM Sports, doing a host of interviews and building up a credible reputation for what I was doing. Well, so credible that guess what? I was in the Caribbean. Was I in the Caribbean? I was in the Caribbean, yeah. I was in Grenada. And you would never believe it, that my cousin, he's a boxing trainer. So when I went into the gym in Grenada, and would you believe, when I went on the mat in the boxing ring, that same ring, Muhammad Ali had his first pro bout in. Hold that thought there for 1 second. Hold the Ali thing there for 1 minute, right? So I'm going around doing all these interviews and stuff. And where was I now? Was I in? I was not. I was in Grenada when I ended up I interviewed a certain James Ali Bashir, trainer of Alexander Usyk, trainer of quite a few other fighters as well, Shannon Briggs, and a lot of heavyweights. Worked with Lennox Lewis, worked with Vladimir Klitschko in camp. What was Emmanuel Stewart's right-hand man, Uncle James Ali Bashir, who I've known for many years, and I can call him Uncle, and a great man and so much knowledge in the sport of boxing. So we can park that for one minute. So all those interviews with all these other trainers that are around as well, and getting these exclusive Uncle Bashir, and then, obviously trainers as well, Peter Fury, and many other list of other trainers as well. Stacey McKillie, Mike Tyson's former trainer. The list goes on and on. Well, would you believe it or not? Let's go on. Would you believe it or not? I got a telephone call I was in Ireland. I got a telephone call. Strange number from the USA. And I'm like, no, before that happened, I was in Grenada. Still in Grenada. And I managed to get an interview with George Foreman III. And he was talking about Keith Thurman's boxing career. He spoke at length about his career and boxing and stuff like that. It was absolutely incredible. The insight that George Foreman III had. I think he was unbeaten in 25 fights or something like that. Good fighter. But again, the press didn't have a lot of respect for George Foreman's junior's career and all the rest of it. Again, they were on top of him. Very articulate young man. Very articulate. And I saw a bright future with George Foreman III. But I don't know why he stopped. I don't understand why he stopped boxing. I didn't get into it. But he was able to give me lots of insight in boxing that I never really... And he talked a lot at length about George as well. Do check out that interview. George Foreman III interview. So there's the connection there. Then, of course, when BWTM, Bayloric TV was up, it was on Facebook. So, of course, I got the opportunity to talk with Roy Foreman, George Foreman's brother. But let's hold it right there. So I came back to England, and I was in Ireland, actually, at the time, for 3 years. And during that time, I got a call one evening. And would you believe the call was from Muhammad Ali. Yes, the Muhammad Ali's brother. So, got an interview with him. And that was great because I got so much information, so much. So, Rahman Ali, he was the former sparring partner of Muhammad Ali. And people say actually Rahman was better than Ali himself. But Rahman sacrificed his career so Ali could go on. So they said, we want you to do an interview with us because you're fair and you allow us to share our side of the story, and a lot of the slanderous rumours and stories that the media put out are not true about Muhammad Ali and his brother. So his brother spoke to me. Um, I can't remember the gentleman's name as well, but he was related to uh, Cuba Gooding Jr. And he gave me extensive. He's got this book where he got all the fighters, you name them, to sign autographs in this book. Check out the interview. Ron Brashear, who was the publicist for Rahman Ali. So Ron Brashear, look him at. He great into boxing as well. So knowledgeable about boxing. So we got there as well. So George Foreman meant a lot to me. Again, another fight I loved a lot was Oscar De La Hoya. And George Foreman would always talk about De La Hoya's shoulders and how big De La Hoya was. And, you know, how if you that's when I first learned about why Lennox Lewis used to lean on guys. Because he says, when you lean on guys, you're a heavyweight, and you lean on a guy who's lighter, you sap the energy out of their legs and of their back. Lennox used to do that a lot. I never understood it, but George Foreman was able to give insight into that when he gave. Also, one of the great things about George when he commentated, he used to give insight into fights, and he would give you insight into what the fight was doing. He would give insights into things you wouldn't like. Only if a boxer would know that. You know, that's what I loved about George's commentary. It was always colourful. I mean, once Larry Merchant was trying to talk with George and talk down to George, and George put him in his place. It was so funny. So yeah, so George Foreman to me, he was more than just a fighter. Oh, and let's to close this all off. Would you believe, back in England, I managed to interview Evander Holyfield and his whole promotional team. And guess who was in that promotional team? Edgar Berlanga. Edgar Berlanga was promoted by the real deal Holyfield. Edgar Berlanga. Yes. And I managed to talk to the real deal Evander Holyfield. When I spoke to real deal, one of the first questions I asked Evander was, what do you think of the video game? And he didn't say he played it much. And anyway, that's another interview you can check out as well. So George Foreman, for me, connected many dots for me. Of course, and I just wanted to take this to say my condolences to the Foreman family. It's I feel like I've lost someone in my family as well. Finally, there was something I read, and somebody said it, and I don't know if this is written and it was taken down, but it said they want to keep the passing of George Foreman a secret. I couldn't read too much. I don't know. With respect, and yeah. Anyway, I'll leave it as that. But Big George will always be in my mind, will always be in my heart and my mind, because he Mora of leaving home and being in. The decision I chose to leave home was to say, I can do it. You don't know what life's about, and I'm going to show you I can handle life. You doubt I'm going to handle life by myself. I'm going to take it on that challenge. George won the heavyweight championship. I said he couldn't do it, but he did it. An inspiration to me. And the amount of times in life I've gone back and played when George looked up to the heavens, and everyone's the world be looked. Thank you. Back. Heavyweight champion of the world. It's not destiny. If that is not a miracle, if that is not, to imagine You lose against Holyfield. You lose against Morrison. But you still push on to believe you're going to be heavyweight champion of the world. But doors opened, he fought Mora, and the rest is history. And they can't take it away from him. And all those people who said he couldn't do it, they had to open their mouths and confess, George Foreman, heavyweight champion of the world. And from being no men, they became yes men. They didn't have the faith in George. They had lack of foresight, but George did it. And what to me, what still confused me is that Mora was always chinny. So I never understood why they thought that Mora was going to get away through 12 rounds and not get hit by once on the chin by George. He was temperamental as well, Mora. Literally, even when he fought Holyfield and he beat Holyfield for the title, Teddy Atlas had to scream in his corner, scream at him. Foreman, a great man. The final thing I wanted to say is this. When Wilder got beat by Tyson Fury, second fight, I said to people, the best person you should talk to is George Foreman. Because George Foreman knows what he'd like to feel humiliation when he got beat by... Because remember, at the time, Wilder was almost like... His punching power was from another planet. Where he was knocking people out. And I knew Wilder couldn't box, but his punching power was something else. And I remember thinking to him, when he got beat, by the way he got beat by Tyson Fury in the second fight, he said the best person he could talk to was George Foreman, because he knows what it's like to be humiliated, or knows what it's like to be defeated and still come back and become heavyweight champion again, world again. And I said George Foreman was the best guy for him to talk to and advise him, because he'd been there and seen it and done it. He, like Wilder, was a big puncher. So there's a mindset of a big puncher. And Wilder was same sort of mentality as Foreman. Go out there and annihilate. That's it. You know? I think mindset's very important. As a coach, I think it's very important. And at that level. And I felt that George could have given him some input. Later on, I understood that Wilder actually did meet and talk with Foreman. There you go. So George Foreman, I just felt for me that guys like Foreman, Holmes, they weren't utilised enough. They really weren't. And they've got these new age trainers now that haven't got a clue. They've not got a clue. And I just think that if Wilder was in different hands, in my opinion, I think he would have had a much better career. As with Anthony Joshua, they would have better careers because they'd be led with brighter minds and people who have achieved a little more and people who've been there and can add that little bit more. And at that level, they need that. But they made their choices, and we've seen the evidence or the fruit of their labour. You've seen it now, which is a shame. I had 2 day greats in and Wilder. Fury was smart, could see what was going on happening. So Sugar Hill. It's to Uncle Bashir from Manuel Stewart. Wow. There are 2 fights I'd love to have seen George Foreman have. I would love to see George Foreman fight against Ernest Shavers. That fight never happened. No, 3 fights. George Foreman, Ernest Shavers, George Foreman, Larry Holmes, and George Foreman, Mike Tyson. Those are 3 fights I would love to have seen. And I think Big George Foreman was a better fighter than George fought the younger guy. I think the younger guy was just wild. George came back, was older, wiser. So yeah. Let me know your thoughts, and if did you know those things that I was telling you about? I mean, putting things together was incredible. Rest with peace, George. Rest with peace.